Welcome to this series on domestic abuse, risk assessments, and MARAC. I'm Dr. Krisha Patel, and I'm a sexual offences examiner working in sexual assault referral centres. In this episode, we are going to briefly go over the background to domestic abuse in England and get a clear definition of what domestic abuse is. Domestic abuse is really common. It is estimated that 5.5% of adults aged 16 to 74 have experienced domestic abuse in the year ending March 2020. And this is based on findings from the Crime Survey for England and Wales and police recorded crime. And as it is estimated that 1 in 20 have experienced domestic abuse in the preceding year, what that means is that domestic abuse is a massive social issue. If you work and socialize with enough people, you are potentially going to be interacting with people who have experienced domestic abuse. The majority of victims of domestic abuse are, of course, female, with the majority of perpetrators being male and partners or ex-partners. So it is a form of gender-based violence. However, domestic abuse is not confined to any particular gender, social background, race, religion, or sexual orientation. And the final point from this slide is that victims of domestic abuse can present to different services in many different ways. So they can present to health services, perhaps they've attended the accident and emergency department with a physical injury, which does not fit the alleged mechanism of injury that's given by the victim. Or they may present with emotional or mental health difficulties, or perhaps an unwanted pregnancy to the midwifery services. They can present to the police. Of course, a large proportion of police calls are domestic related. They can present to school and educational services, so that can be a parent of a child. Of course, they can present to social care and safeguarding services, to housing and benefit services, and to their employers. So what is domestic abuse and what types of domestic abuse can you think of? I'd like you to pause the video here and write down or discuss your answers with each other. And the next question to you is, what is the key legislation that defines what domestic abuse is in the UK? So the key legislation which creates a statutory definition of domestic abuse is the Domestic Abuse Act 2021. And one of the most important things that the Domestic Abuse Act does is emphasize that domestic abuse does not need to include physical violence. The terminology that we use today is domestic abuse rather than domestic violence. Using the term domestic violence suggests that there needs to be physical or sexual violence involved for a relationship to be considered abusive. And that does not show a good understanding of the dynamics of domestic abuse. In the past, police would be called out to domestic incidents, and they would see domestic abuse only in the physical terms and physical harm. Domestic abuse advocates had to campaign tirelessly to change the law and to fully recognise other forms of abuse can occur that don't include violence, things like coercive control, emotional and psychological abuse. And these three things, coercive control, emotional and psychological abuse, are really at the heart of domestic abuse. They can be just as severe as physical and sexual violence, or for some people, the effects of coercive control, psychological and emotional abuse can be even more severe and have even longer lasting effects than the physical or sexual abuse. Coercive control, psychological and emotional abuse are also massive barriers when it comes to victims trying to exit an abusive relationship. And there have been some significant changes in the law since 2015, where the UK led the way when the law of coercive and controlling behaviour was introduced in the Serious Crime Act 2015. And this essentially criminalized behaviour that was coercive and controlling in a domestic setting. And now with the recent Domestic Abuse Bill 2021, the law fully recognises that domestic abuse can come in many forms and does not need to include violence. In the next episode, we're going to learn a bit more about what coercive control means, what psychological and emotional abuse means, and what economic abuse means. And we're going to discuss some examples of each. Thanks for listening to this episode on domestic abuse, risk assessments, and MARAC. If you found this session useful, don't forget to like and subscribe and check out the other videos on my channel.